morning. Please be seated. Well done to all the teams that were in action yesterday. We have another big weekend ahead. I hope there'll be the support that we received last weekend and that teams will do well. In 2004, we began what has become one of Roxbury Latin's proudest traditions. Since the inception of the F. Washington Jarvis International Fund Lecture, we have welcomed 19 distinguished public servants and thinkers on foreign affairs, including economist Paul Volcker, Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense, Lisa Monaco, Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, John Brennan, former Director of the CIA, Professor Bill Taubman, who spoke to us about Russian and U.S. relations over many decades, Ambassador Harriet Elam Thomas, who reminded us of the critical role of diverse perspectives in the work of foreign affairs, Dr. Javier Corrales, who spoke with us about democracy in Latin America, and last year, David Diaz, who provided a stellar example of a career committed to national security, foreign policy, and public service. Today, we host the 20th Annual Jarvis Fund Lecture, named for the man who for 30 years led Roxbury Latin as its 10th headmaster, the Reverend Tony Jarvis, who died 5 years ago this month. Those of us who knew Tony miss him very much, and all of us associated with RL owe him a debt of gratitude for transforming our school. We are so glad to have this lecture named for him as one way to remind us in perpetuity of his lasting impact. The genesis of this fund was twofold. First, the appreciation that alumnus Jack Hennessy, class of 1954, and his wife Margarita had for the distinguished work that Mr. Jarvis did during his time here. And second, their conviction that Americans in general, and Roxbury Latin's teachers and students in particular, could benefit from greater exposure to issues concerning the United States' place in the world. The Hennessys envisioned this fund helping to bring to the school distinguished thinkers on world affairs, as well as enabling the boys and faculty to experience firsthand, by sending them out into the world, cultures different from our own. Since the fund was established in 2004, hundreds of boys and faculty members have been afforded the opportunity to travel to foreign countries. As a result, they have developed new perspectives on many political, economic, historical, and cultural issues. We were glad this past spring and summer to continue the various trips that have become a hallmark of RL's program. Boys practicing the French and Spanish languages they're so effectively taught during immersion trips in Caen, France, and Cadiz, Spain. Class 2 boys extending their studies and expanding their worldview in Senegal this June. 50s spending several days in Quebec City with Monsieur Diop and Madame White during March break. And our Glee Club regularly touring during spring break, performing in cities near and far in 2022, in Austria and the Czech Republic, and this March to Italy. RL faculty have routinely benefited from educational forays to distant places as well. In order to provide a sense of the impact our commitment to foreign travel has had on this community, I would ask, as I do every year, that boys and teachers, if during your time at the school you have traveled to a foreign country on a trip sponsored by Roxbury Latin, to please stand. Thank you. That's quite significant. Finally today, I want to recognize Jack and Margarita Hennessy, who unfortunately could not be with us this morning. Mr. Hennessy is a member of the class of 54, as I mentioned, and a former member of Roxbury Latin's Board of Trustees. Both he and Mrs. Hennessy have throughout their lives represented an unusual engagement with other nations and cultures. Throughout their lives, too, they have generously provided the philanthropic wherewithal in order that others might come to know and appreciate various corners of our increasingly interconnected world. And as we all know, the Hennessys helped to make possible in the IAF, Hennessy Rink, home of RL's hockey program. This morning, we are honored to have with us, as Roxbury Latin's 20th Jarvis Lecturer, Dr. Michael Beckley. Dr. Beckley has spent his career focused on international relations, specifically in understanding the power dynamics between two of the world's largest economic players, the United States and China. In paying attention to the headlines today and in recent history, we know that the interplay between our country and China is a significant force in the global economy, and the relationship between our two countries is one of high importance and of high interest to countries around the world. Through his teaching, research, writing, and public commentary, Dr. Beckley develops and shares insights about these dynamics as he will do with us this morning. Dr. Beckley is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and director of the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. His research on great power competition has earned him multiple awards and has inspired appearances in numerous media, from The Atlantic to the New York Times, from NPR to the Wall Street Journal. Prior to his current role, Dr. Beckley was an international security fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He also worked for the U.S. Department of Defense, the RAND Corporation, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He continues to advise offices within the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. Department of Defense. Dr. Beckley earned his bachelor's degree in international studies from Emory University and his PhD in political science from Columbia. His first book, Unrivaled: Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower, was published in 2018, and his most recent book, Danger Zone: The Coming Conflict with China, was published in 2022. Please help me in welcoming to Roxbury Latin this morning an impressive thinker about U.S.-China relations, Dr. Michael Beckley.
Well, thank you very much, Headmaster Brennan, for welcoming me here. Thank you all for coming here. It's really a privilege and an honor to speak, and not just in front of such a distinguished bunch, but such a handsome-looking bunch with all of your wonderful ties on. With the largest land war going on in Europe since World War II, and what I fear is going to be a massive war in the Middle East, I wish I could come here and give you some rosy news about East Asia, but I'm not going to do that because I'm actually very worried about East Asia as well. And what I want to talk about are two trends that you've probably noticed. One, the slowdown in China's economy, and the second, how China has been getting more repressive internally and more aggressive on the international stage over the last decade. And the main point I want to make is I think these two things are related. They're intimately related. I think that China is becoming more repressive and aggressive, in part because it's reached the most volatile and dangerous period in the life cycle of a great power. So you've had 40 years of rapid economic growth in China, and that has equipped Beijing with immense capabilities and sky-high ambitions to shake up the world. But now China is facing a severe economic slowdown. It's increasingly getting encircled, especially by the United States and its allies. And these trends, the strategic encirclement and the economic slowdown, threaten to crush Beijing's dreams of great global power unless it takes decisive action in the short term to secure its regime, to reboot its economy, and to try to break that emerging ring of encirclement that's forming around it. And I'm so worried because I study a lot of diplomatic history, and we've actually seen this kind of pattern play out in the past, where you have a rising power that's been growing very quickly, gaining in international power and prestige, but then it faces the prospect of future decline, and its leaders start to worry that if they don't get moving, that they're going to face future decline going forward. And so what we found is these powers, they don't mellow out and just kind of modestly dial back their ambitions and say, oh, we gave it a good go, and I guess we'll just kind of settle into second or third place status. What they usually do is use the iron fist of state power to batter their way through the tough times, to try to rekindle their rise, or just grab whatever they can while they still can. And there are extreme, catastrophic examples of this playing out. So Germany starts World War I in large part because the Germans were worried that they were going to get crushed in a vice between France, Britain, and Russia that was forming around them, and they wanted to break through that ring. Imperial Japan starts World War II in Asia, in part because the United States, they feared that the United States was going to choke out their emerging empire that was forming there. So there are extreme examples, but even the more modest examples, some of which I'll go through in a bit, are pretty bad from a foreign policy perspective, because even if you don't get a hot war, you almost always get a Cold War situation, where you have a period of high geopolitical tensions that divides big parts of the world, disrupts supply chains, investment patterns, and I realize this might not be immediately obvious just because it's so different from what we've gotten used to over the last 40 years, really for your entire lifetime. This idea of a rising China and one world, one dream, hyper-globalization where everyone can cooperate in this big global economy. That's actually not the norm. Geopolitical conflict is much more the historical norm and I fear our likely future. So I'll spend the next 20 to 25 minutes sketching out this rosy point of view, and I'll basically just make 2 points. The first is I think China's rise, as we've known it, is over, and the second, why I think this actually means a more divided and dangerous world. So on the first point, this idea that China's rise is over, I realize that may not be obvious because China's been rising for so long, so fast, that most people think it's a constant of the international system. So at Tufts, when we teach our graduate students at the Fletcher School, we still ask them to write an essay. Do you think China's rise will be peaceful? And use these different theories to analyze that as if it's just this constant feature of world politics. And you know, if you were born after 1978, as pretty much almost everyone in this room probably was, you know, you've only known a booming China. But really the past 40 years of peace and prosperity are an anomaly. Most of modern Chinese history is actually a tale of war and poverty. And the exceptional rise that we've seen over the last 40 years was the result of a few exceptional and fleeting circumstances. So let me just briefly explain those. The first of these circumstances was just basic security. So for the past 4 decades, China has enjoyed the most secure position in its modern history. And that's really important because China is an incredibly rough neighborhood. It's surrounded by 19 countries. Most of those neighbors are either very powerful, or they're unstable, or there's some combination of powerful and unstable. If you've ever played Risk with your family, you know that holding Eurasia is pretty much impossible. And that's what China has to do every single day, and it's often failed to do so. So for 100 years, from the first Opium War in 1839 until the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, China just gets ripped apart by imperialist powers. First, the British, who were basically narco-traffickers. They came there to sell drugs so that they could use the money to bankroll their empire in India, and then followed by the French, the Germans, the Russians, and of course the Japanese, who inflict really just utter brutality on China. In all the chaos, China collapses into 2 of the worst civil wars in human history. And then even after 1949, even after the communists win the Civil War and Mao Zedong establishes his government and the party unifies the country, China almost immediately becomes the #1 enemy of the United States because you had the outbreak of the Korean War, and you had direct fighting between the US and the South Korean side, China and North Korea. And then in 1960, China's alliance with the Soviet Union falls apart, and at that point, China becomes the chief enemy of both Cold War superpowers. They both feared Mao's China more than the United States and the Soviet Union feared each other because they both viewed China as the more radical, as a rogue state, essentially, that could really shake up the world. So not surprisingly, China was isolated and impoverished throughout this time. And so it's not till the opening between the United States and China that occurs at the beginning of the 1970s that China finally gets some reprieve from this geopolitical vice that it had been in, because China suddenly had a superpower on its side. So the Nixon administration on multiple occasions warned the Soviets not to attack China. And more importantly, the United States then starts to fast-track China's integration into Western markets and capital. And the timing of this is perfect. I wish I could show you a graph, but basically China opens up right as this period that we now call hyper-globalization really starts to kick in the 1970s and 1980s, where world trade around the world just increases by a factor of 6 between the 1970s and the early 2000s, and China both rides and propels this wave of trade and investment to become what we know of it today as this massive manufacturing juggernaut and as central to supply chains around the world. So the first factor that China had going for it was unprecedented security and economic access, and that was largely underpinned by at least a decent relationship with the United States. I'll explain how that seems to be going away in just a second. But the second factor that China had going for it was at least not awful government. So Mao Zedong dies in 1976, and China's leaders basically say, let's not have another cultural revolution where we are getting the Chinese people to critique and criticize and imprison political elites. They say, let's start rewarding officials for economic performance rather than just blind political loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. Let's gradually start to allow the Chinese people to be more entrepreneurial, to start engaging in trade amongst each other, and to be freed from rigid state planning. And so Chinese leaders at that point commit to what Deng Xiaoping eventually calls reform and opening. This idea we're going to reform the economy, open up to the outside, and this helps propel a boom of economic activity. So China had the right policies at the right time to really set itself up for a great rise. The third factor is China enjoyed the greatest demographic dividend in human history. So for much of the last 35 years, China had anywhere between 10 to 15 workers, people of working age, to support every senior citizen in its population. That's 2 to 3 times the global average. It's 5 times what the United States currently has in terms of number of working adults to support its senior citizen population. And this bubble was the unrepeatable result of China's very peculiar population history. So basically in the 50s and 60s, Mao's government incentivized Chinese families to have as many children as possible because Mao wanted to turn China into a superpower. The population had been decimated by decades of war and strife, and so he said, we just got to have a big population boom. And the population, Chinese families oblige, and the population explodes by 80% in just 30 years. But then in the 1970s, the late 1970s, the Chinese government starts to worry about the opposite, too big of a population. And so they implement the infamous one-child policy. And so for the past 30 years, things have been great demographically in China. You had this massive baby boom generation in the prime of their working lives, and they had relatively few elderly parents to take care of because so many of those previous generations had died in the war and the strife and the turmoil in China. And then they had relatively few children to take care of because they were legally barred from having them. And so the population, I don't think any population in human history has been this primed for economic productivity. Demographers think this population bubble alone explains at least 25% of China's rapid growth over the last 30 years. And then the fourth and final factor is China had abundant natural resources in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even as late as the early 2000s. It was largely self-sufficient in just basic things like water, food, energy. And easy access to those resources made economic growth very cheap because you could just set up a factory, you have all the raw materials you need, they're easily accessible, you can just plow through them. Lax environmental laws allow you to just pollute as much as you need to, and you can churn out whatever goods you're producing. So from the 1970s really all the way up until the early 2010s, I would say, China had all these factors of success working for it. And the result is, the most successful case of economic development in history. China, by some measures, has the largest economy in the world. It's a top trading partner of a majority of the countries in the world. And it's clearly the second most powerful country in the world and has to have its voice heard on any international issue. So there's no question that China has arrived, but the question that I'm raising today is over its future trajectory. Are things going to still get better for China in the future? And I think the fundamental problem is this: all of those tailwinds I just mentioned that have propelled China's rise over the last few decades are rapidly turning into headwinds that are pushing back on China. So for starters, China is running out of resources. Half of the rivers in China are just gone. They've either dried up or they're so polluted you can't go anywhere near them. 60% of the groundwater, which is how you get most of your drinking water, is so polluted that the Chinese government itself deemed it unfit for human contact. So it's not that you just can't drink it. If you touch the water, you're in trouble, which means you can't use that water even for agriculture, for business. So China's also plowed through most of its exploitable oil. Coal is becoming harder to come by. And so China is now the world's largest importer of energy resources. China has also lost about half of its farmland, which is either too polluted or it's just turned into desert because you've sucked all the water out of it. And that's a big problem when you have 1.4 billion mouths to feed. And just to show the government's concerns about this, the government in China recently banned large banquets and eating contests because they want to encourage the population to conserve food. China is now the largest importer of food in the entire world. And this resource scarcity, it's not just a humanitarian issue, it's also just driven up the price of economic development. Each unit of economic growth is now 3 times more expensive for China to produce today than it was in the 2000s. So you have to spend 3 times more investment to wring out the same amount of GDP growth today as just a little over a decade ago. China's also running out of people. That baby boom generation I mentioned is now retiring, and they're falling onto the backs of a tiny one-child generation. China is already using more adult diapers than baby diapers at this point. Between now and 2035, China's going to lose 70 million working-age adults. That's like an entire France of workers just taken out of China's economy in just a little more than a decade. At the same time, China's going to be adding an entire Japan of senior citizens. So 130 million senior citizens are going to emerge in China's population. This is happening in just over a decade. That 15-to-1 ratio I mentioned earlier of workers for retirees, that's going to plummet to 2-to-1, 2 workers to support every retiree by the 2030s. So this is coming just within a decade. And I think dealing with these problems is going to be especially difficult because China is now ruled by a dictator who consistently sacrifices economic growth to enhance his own political control. So under Xi Jinping, if you just look at where the money from China's government is flowing, roughly 80% of the government subsidies go to state-owned or state-connected firms. Private firms, on the other hand, are starved of capital. Xi Jinping has launched this anti-corruption campaign, but he only seems to go after the corruption of people he doesn't like, his political opponents, whereas cronies are propped up. Negative economic news has been essentially censored unless it's explicitly condoned by Beijing. So, I mean, none of this really looks promising from, hey, we can turn this economic engine around. And then finally, rich democracies, which still to this day control more than half the world's stocks of wealth, the assets around the world, now are starting to turn on China. They're no longer welcoming China into their markets unheeded. The United States is sort of leading the charge. It's waging a full-blown trade and tech war against China. I think the cutting China off from advanced computer chips and the machines to make them, that alone threatens China's technological ambitions. But you also have the European Union, Japan, others following suit. And so if you just look at data sets, China now faces thousands of new trade and investment barriers today that it didn't face as recently as 5 years ago, and they only seem to be proliferating. So China faces all these headwinds, and they've already started to bite. This slowdown that we're seeing right now actually started more than a decade ago. So China's economic growth rates have been declining. In the 2010s, they dropped by half. So 50% lower economic growth rates. Then COVID came along and dragged the economy down by another 2/3. And then zero COVID, locking down the whole population. I think the estimates that suggest there was essentially zero real growth in the Chinese economy during that time are accurate. The government has been reporting 3% growth, but China historically has over-reported its growth rates by about 3%, so I urge you to take those with a grain of salt. But the bigger problem is the quality of China's economic growth has deteriorated in recent years. So most of the current growth is now generated just from government stimulus spending. The government just pumping more money through the economy, whereas productivity, what you really need to grow an economy, that is making more stuff using less stuff, so getting more efficient over time. By that metric, China has actually gone down by about 12% over the last decade. So in other words, China is spending more and more to produce less and less. And we haven't seen this kind of productivity plunge from any major nations since the 1980s Soviet Union, which is not an example that you want to emulate from an economic perspective if you want to be a great power. And if you've spent any time in China over the last decade, the tangible signs of this very wasteful growth model are ubiquitous. You see these so-called ghost cities, big apartment complexes that nobody lives there. You see a lot of what economists call excess capacity, so factories that have been built that are going at 20%, 30%, goods rotting on warehouse shelves, all these. I've even seen giant parking lots filled with electric vehicles that are just rotting out in the sun because it's just propelled by this constant government stimulus spending. And the result has been a surge in Chinese debt. So over the last 10 years, China has taken out $30 trillion in new credit. So take $30 trillion, put it on the credit card. That's equivalent to about a third of the entire global economy, basically racked up as debt that's going to have to be paid back at some time. And so a lot of my research compares the rise and fall of great powers over centuries. And I can tell you that any country that has accumulated debt as fast as China is racking it up, any country that has lost productivity at China's rate or aged at anything close to China's current pace has gone on to suffer at least one so-called lost decade of essentially 0% economic growth. So maybe China will beat those trends, but I'm just telling you the historical record is not very promising. And so these economic headwinds are hitting China at the same time that China is confronting an increasingly hostile external environment. So around the world, negative views of China have surged to levels we haven't seen since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. And they're starting to manifest themselves in ways that are making life increasingly hard for Beijing. You have the United States, which I know the Biden administration says they're not trying to contain China, but I think this looks very much like a containment strategy on behalf of the United States. You have the Taiwanese, which increasingly just view themselves as Taiwanese and absolutely do not ever want to go back and be ruled by Beijing. You have the Japanese, who are doubling their defense spending over the next 5 years. India is massing forces on its border with China. You have all these anti-China alliances popping up. So you might have heard of the Quad in Asia, which links Japan, the United States, Australia, India together. There's AUKUS, Australia, UK, the United States, other organizations. And even the Europeans have suspended their investment treaty. And you have Britain, France, Germany sending sort of token warships into the South China Sea that China claims to say, no, this is not in fact Chinese territory, these are international waters. So the question is, how is China going to react to these headwinds? What does this mean? And so this is sort of the second and final point I'll make. And I fear that China is not going to react particularly well to these. To me, it looks like a classic peaking power. It has the means to really upend key parts of the international system because it's coming off this 4-decade bonanza of rapid economic growth. But at the same time, it has the motive to move more aggressively in the short term because trends are starting to turn against it. And if it does nothing, then its aspirations will be crushed by economic stagnation and strategic encirclement. And so I think we're already seeing a China that is more eager to squeeze out wealth wherever it can, to become more self-reliant so that other countries can't impose the kind of sanctions that Russia is currently being subjected to squelch any kind of threats to the CCP's rule, and possibly to lunge for the territories that the Chinese government has long said, this is Chinese territory, and it's only a matter of time before we take it back. Obviously, Taiwan, roughly 80 to 90% of the East and South China Seas. So we've seen this throughout history. In my own research, I've looked at many cases of these peaking powers, and I can tell you that none really went down quietly. A few of them even started catastrophic wars. I mentioned the Germany World War I horror example, but there's other examples, some that might surprise you. So the United States, in fact, is one of these cases. So in the late 19th century, the United States had this post-Civil War economic boom fizzle out and turn into some of the worst depressions other than the Great Depression. So in the 1880s, the 1890s, the US economy was just racked by depression after depression. And there was also this perception among Americans that the reason our economy is stalling is we've already sort of conquered our way across the continental United States, and we're running out of frontiers to cultivate, new land, new greenfield investment opportunities. This became, there's books literally called The Disappearing Frontier written around this time. And so the United States responds to this stagnation by basically with a surge of imperialism, by pumping exports and investment into Latin America and Asia, and then building a giant navy to protect those investments, and then annexing territory in those regions. And so when times got tough, the United States got moving. The same thing happened to Russia around the same time, the turn of the 20th century. Russia's economic boom fizzles out, and the Tsar at the time put 70% of the country under martial law, and then sent hundreds of thousands of troops into Manchuria and Korea to conquer territory, to get resources and access to warm water ports. And they basically stayed there until the Japanese booted them out in the Russo-Japanese War. 1930s, Germany and Japan, we know that story well, I won't go into it. But even more recently, Putin's Russia I think falls into this category, because people forget that Russia was a rising power in the 2000s. It was banging out roughly 7 to 8% economic growth rates every year, largely because of high oil and natural gas prices. So the Kremlin's coffers were flush and the patronage system was flowing, and Putin looked like a genius leader, a master strategist. But then after the 2008 financial crisis, oil and gas prices plummet. The demand for a lot of Russian goods goes down, and it drags down Russia's economy and Putin's popularity with it. He reacts in part by basically pressuring former Soviet states to join this Russian customs union that he called the Eurasian Economic Union, where basically you don't get to trade with other countries, you have to trade directly with Russia. If you trade with other countries, you have to put big tariffs on them, but if you trade with Russia, we'll lower tariffs for you. So basically trying to turn these former Soviet states into economic vassals of Moscow. Ukraine, through some change, decides, thanks but no thanks. We were really interested in this trade deal with the EU, and we want to go that way. And we are now seeing the after effects of how that tug of war between the West and Russia turns out. So this pattern plays out again and again. It's the rise followed by the fear of a future fall that really causes these countries to become more aggressive. And now China looks to be repeating some of the classic signs of these peaking powers. So as far as I see it, China has been doing several things in response. One is just ruling the country with an iron fist. So reasserting the Chinese Communist Party's control over every organization. So any company, any university, any school like this one would have to have a political commissar there on staff to make sure that we're all abiding by the dictates of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. You have to store all of your data locally and hand it over to the state. Economic goals are increasingly designed by political targets, not market forces. And if you're an entrepreneur and you start running your mouth a little too much, you get a little too outspoken, you're going to have your economic empire dismantled. So Jack Ma, the head of Alibaba, he basically got disappeared for a while. He's been exiled, and his empire has been hived off and sold off to a bunch of state-owned firms. And the way I would describe this is sort of the anti-Gorbachev policy. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. Under Xi Jinping, Chinese Communist Party leaders have to study the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is like the #1 lesson. How do we prevent the same thing from happening to the Chinese Communist Party? Xi Jinping himself has given multiple internal speeches, like only to members of the Chinese Communist Party, where he said, why did the Soviet Union collapse? And these are his words: because nobody was man enough to stand up and do what was right. And I think in the Chinese calculus, in 1989, communist regimes were under pressure. The Soviet Union tried to make nice with the West. They tried to open up and reform the economy, and they collapsed. China sent tanks into the streets in Tiananmen and elsewhere, and now China is the second most powerful country in the world. That is a lesson that I think has been drained and drilled into the heads of the top leaders in the economy, and so that means really ruling the country with an iron fist. You've seen that kind of repression increase, not just in Hong Kong, but really across the whole country. The second part of China's response is this increasing emphasis on economic self-reliance. This idea we can no longer trust the Americans, the Europeans, the Japanese to give us access to their market. They're going to cut us off from technology and investment. We're in a hostile world. They're going to use choke points to try to strangle our economy. And so we need to actively replace foreign partners with domestic Chinese firms and workers. And where we can't do that, we need to expand abroad through this Belt and Road initiative that you might have heard of, to really try to get our own economic empire, our own partners that are more pliant, that will sell us what we need. We'll give them investment. In return, they give us easy access to their resources and their ports. And so you've seen China expand dramatically in what I guess we're now calling the global south. So a lot of developing countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Southeast and Central Asia, really to try to get new economic partners that will be more willing to do Beijing's bidding, and that China can feel more secure, that it'll have access to the markets and resources that it needs. And then finally, and what I worry about most, is a territorial grab. So China is not just any global power, it's what we call a revanchist great power. According to the CCP, there are lost Chinese territories that need to be taken back, that aren't actual countries or international waters, much like Putin says Ukraine is not a country and needs to be conquered. And so I'm obviously talking about Taiwan. I'm also talking about chunks of India that are literally the size of Austria or other mid-sized European countries. We're talking about giant pieces of territory there, as well as roughly 80% of the East and South China Seas. And China has long claimed these territories, basically since the start of the Chinese Communist Party. But over the last 30 years, China generally took a patient and peaceful approach to bringing these territories back. And I think that's in large part because China's economy was booming. And so the Chinese said, we can wait for better days ahead. We're only going to get more powerful. Other countries, they want to get access to our market. We have lots of leverage. So we can use economic manifest destiny to eventually reabsorb Taiwan and to enhance our control over the East and South China Seas. But now that China's economy is slowing, other countries are less enthralled by access to China's market. They're much more worried about Chinese aggression. They're starting to push back. And so, you see countries all around China's periphery beefing up their militaries, forming alliances with each other. And so, with something like Taiwan, I think the Chinese rightly calculate that peaceful means of cajoling these lost territories to come back to the motherland, those are dwindling very quickly. On the other hand, China has built up this giant military. Over the last 10 years, China has churned out warships and missiles at a rate we haven't seen from any country since World War II. And so I think we have to worry that there is this strategic window of opportunity for Beijing. They have this powerful military. In the United States and Taiwan have been very slow to respond, for example, but they have plans to really improve their militaries by the 2030s. And so we have to just worry that if you're a strategist in Beijing, when is it ever going to be easier to make a move on something like Taiwan? I think the chance of war is low. I think there's maybe a 10% chance of a war over something like Taiwan, but a 10% chance of a catastrophic war is still way too high for me to sleep at night. And just looking at the history, I can see how this could play out. So I'll just end by saying, obviously, all of these aspects of China's new strategy fuel tension with the United States. And that's why, unfortunately, I've come around to this idea that the best case scenario is a sort of Cold War style standoff. It's not going to be a carbon copy of the Cold War, because obviously China is very different than the Soviet Union. The world is just different than it was in the 50s and 60s, where you had decolonization in all these areas of the world, forming new nation states that their governments were basically up for grabs, and the US and the Soviet Union were trying to shape those. But I think you are going to have the two basic elements of a Cold War going forward, namely a real conflict of vital interests. This is not a misunderstanding. In fact, I think the problem is that the United States and China understand each other very well, and they dislike what they see for logical reasons. And so it's a genuine clash of interests. And the second is that the sides are not just going to agree to disagree. I think they're going to increasingly try to grind each other down with every tool short of outright war. So sanctions, espionage, shows of force. Obviously, no one in China or the United States wants a hot war, but neither government is willing to take force completely off the table. And so we're sort of stuck in this period of tension. Now, the good news is I think all of those problems I mentioned that China faces will make it a less competitive long-term rival of the United States. And so this period of tension hopefully won't last for our lifetimes or like the 40-something years of the Cold War, because China's economy is already starting to slow, and hopefully maybe Xi Jinping's successors, within a decade or two, will realize that their aspirations to radically redraw the map in East Asia or ensconce China as this dominant power will just be unattainable, and that they'll have to dial back their ambitions through diplomatic moderation, internal reform. So maybe in a decade or two, this round of hostility will run its course, but my fear and the main message that I would want to send today is that this decade in the 2020s, I view as a moment of maximum geopolitical risk, just because of these factors in Asia. Put Europe and the Middle East aside, because China is just at a very historically dangerous and decisive moment in its life cycle as a great power. And so we have to be clear about whom we're dealing with and the game that is being played. And that has a whole number of implications for U.S. policy going forward. But on that happy note, I'll just stop for discussion. And I look forward to your questions and to meeting some of you in classes after this. But thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. I appreciate it. Okay, so I've been told to just take questions myself, so if you want to have a question or make a statement, just raise your hand. Yes, sir.
In a world with the U.S. stalemated towards China and Russia, does the U.S. face a very dangerous alliance that feels cornered and liable to act very irrationally?
Yeah, I think this is what makes this a. Yeah, so the question is, China and Russia seem to be basically forming an alliance together. China has been providing material support to Russia's war in Ukraine. You see this bromance between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. They call each other their best friend. They call each other on their birthdays. And it just looks like these two countries are increasingly allied against their common chief rival, namely the West and in particular the United States. So how do you handle that if you're a country like the United States and U.S. allies? And I think that is an incredibly tricky question. I think the first thing you don't do is assume that you can just focus on one while ignoring the other. So there is a big body of opinion right now among top strategists down in D.C., some of whom say the United States should stop supplying Ukraine in the war because every missile launcher that is given to the Ukrainians means one less missile launcher for Taiwan. And the real focus should be Asia because China is a much greater threat than Russia given the size of its economy and military. I think that view is incredibly short-sighted. I think that the strategy the United States needs in East Asia runs through Europe. For one reason, the United States needs its European allies on its side because if there's a war over Taiwan, if you're going to try to use economic sanctions to encourage China to back down, you need the European Union to impose some of those sanctions, which means you need to take Europe's security problems seriously. The second reason is simply that if Russia just overwhelms Ukraine, I worry that this new sort of access of Beijing and Moscow will be emboldened and empowered to take even more territory from the West. I mean, Russia has said our territorial aims don't stop in Ukraine, they start there. The Baltic states, all these former Soviet states, they belong to us and are going to be taken back. And China also has to feel that, hey, if Russia can do it, then that emboldens us to maybe make a move in East Asia. So unfortunately, I think you have to view these things, you have to view both ends, basically look at Eurasia. Don't think in terms of Europe and Asia and realize that standing up to Russia in Ukraine is part and parcel of an effective strategy to hopefully deter China from making similar moves in East Asia. Yes, sir.
Especially given China's trying to learn from its mistakes of the fall of the Soviet Union, what do you see happening differently from like the end of the Cold War and now with the U.S. and China?
Yeah, unfortunately, so I often see, the Chinese diplomats, they are quick to shoot down the idea that we're in a new Cold War. And it makes sense from their perspective because they say, oh, you want a Cold War? So does that mean you get to play the role of the United States and we have to play the role of the Soviet Union? We don't want to play the role of the Soviet Union. And so I think, they, at the party school, the Chinese Communist Party school, the #1 lesson in the curriculum is studying the Soviet collapse. And this is why I describe Xi Jinping's current strategy as the anti-Gorbachev policy. Whatever Gorbachev did, we're going to do the opposite of that. So Gorbachev cut military spending. We're going to massively increase military spending. Gorbachev withdrew the Soviet Communist Party from firms, from organizations. We're going to reinsert the Chinese Communist Party into every organization in the country. Gorbachev tried to open up somewhat to the West, Western markets, to let go of some of the minority regions, the republics within the Soviet Union. China is saying, no, we're going to clamp down. We're going to close down to the West, increase our self-reliance, and far-flung regions, whether it's Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, we're not going to give them leeway. We're going to increasingly try to grab onto them because we don't want to have the centrifugal forces that tore apart the Soviet Union rip us apart as well. So I think, unfortunately, the fact that the original Cold War ended peacefully with a number of Soviet concessions actually makes it less likely in the Chinese case because they have explicitly studied that case and are determined to do the exact opposite. Now, my hope is that if these economic troubles persist, if China just increasingly feels encircled, to say, you know what, maybe the Soviets were kind of onto something. Yes, they lost their superpower status, but at least there wasn't a catastrophic war, and we no longer have the gas in our tank to really wage this forever Cold War against the West. But I don't think we can count on that, and so we may be having to gear up for a generational struggle. Again, it's not the end of the world. You know, the norm in history are these kind of Cold War standoffs, but it just means that this idea of a world where the world is our oyster and you can go travel and get a visa to anywhere you want to go and your cell phone will work whether you're in Beijing or in Washington, D.C., and you could easily do business all around the world. That world, I'm afraid, is unlikely for the foreseeable future. Other questions? Yes, sir.
How do you think of non-peaceful approach in relation to like China's future and the way in which they go about kind of declining its global role? What do you think a non-peaceful approach would look like if that were to happen?
Okay, yeah, so the question is what sort of non-peaceful means might China use here? I worry overwhelmingly about Taiwan just because as strong as the US military is and as scary as it is, the United States has to lug all of its forces across an ocean to fight, whereas Taiwan is 100 miles from the Chinese mainland. So China could, in a war over Taiwan, could use its entire mainland as basically a base of operations, can strike targets all over Taiwan with never having to leave China's own territory. And the United States only has 2 military bases within even 500 miles of Taiwan. They're both on Okinawa. China, smartly, has acquired thousands of missiles that could pulverize both of those bases at the outset of a conflict. And if that happens, the United States has to fight from Guam, which is more than 1,000 miles away, which is a problem because American fighter aircraft run out of gas after less than 1,000 miles. So they could not make it to the Taiwan Strait and back. They have to be refueled in midair. You can imagine the complications of having to have a gas line basically in midair over the Western Pacific. So the bottom line is China, I think quite astutely, has exploited the fact that the United States is very powerful but has to concentrate its military eggs in just a few baskets. And so that just means American deterrence is not very strong in the Taiwan Strait, which is why I worry much more about that than, say, like a Chinese assault on Japan, et cetera. And the Chinese have said, you know, Taiwan, it belongs to us. It's the site of this renegade rival Chinese government that is democratic and allied basically with the United States. That, if you're the Chinese Communist Party, that cannot be allowed to stand. And Xi Jinping himself has said it is an inevitable requirement of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation that Taiwan be brought back. We have elections coming up in Taiwan in January of 2024, so coming right around the corner. The current administration in Taiwan has been very pragmatic, not wanting to rock the boat, not wanting to antagonize Beijing. But you know, in an election, Democratic politicians will start, you know, running their mouth and making all kinds of claims. And so I worry that the candidates in those elections, some of them will say, hey, we want to move closer to independence. And you may have provocations that may induce exactly this kind of war, because if you're China, you're looking at the long-term trends. The Taiwanese increasingly see themselves as Taiwanese and not as Chinese, and support for any reunification is dwindling by the day. So it's only going to get worse from a CCP perspective. And so at what point does China abandon its restraint and start flexing its military muscles? Already China's conducting the largest show of force in the Taiwan Strait. It's been sustained over the last 2 years, sending dozens of warships and fighter aircraft buzzing around Taiwan, firing missiles over Taiwan. I mean, this is all going on as we speak right now. And so it just does not look like a country that is willing to forever just be restrained, kick the can down the road, agree to disagree on this issue. So I worry very much about an assault on Taiwan, either an invasion or a blockade situation. They try to cut Taiwan off from the outside world. They've already demonstrated that they can do that. You know, after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the Chinese surrounded the island with warships. So it was kind of a preview of what a potential operation could look like.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm being dragged off stage. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much to Professor Beckley. It's an example, again, of mastery of a topic, a very complicated one, and the likes of which that you encounter with your teachers here at Roxbury Latin, but you'll encounter even more on college campuses where someone is a specialist like this who can share his views as eloquently as he has today. We're grateful for his being here today. He'll be in Mr. Kelly's classes the first couple of periods, and we look forward to his work there as well. And now, please, a rousing rendition of God is Our Strength and Refuge. Thanks. Class 1.